President DeGioia's invitation started me thinking about the many similarities between Jesuits and News Corporation. Both the Jesuits and News Corporation attract highly talented people from all over the globe. Both the Jesuits and News Corporation like to challenge the status quo. And both the Jesuits and News Corporation have a reputation for independence and innovation. Of course, there are some differences. I don't want to discourage anyone who might be considering the priesthood. But I will tell you that at News Corporation, we don't insist on vows of poverty or chastity. And as chief executive, I can tell you that I'm sometimes not sure about the degree of obedience either.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action.
DUP leader Ian Paisley was jostled, punched and then dragged out of the European Parliament today after interrupting a speech by the Pope. The disturbance came within seconds of the Pope starting to speak. Other Euro MPs responded angrily when Dr. Paisley heckled the Pope, saying he was the Antichrist.
Permit me to say how much I
Mr. Paisley, I call you to order and I ask you to stop this disturbance. For the second time, Mr. Paisley, I call you to order and I ask you to respect the dignity of this House. Mr. Paisley, I now exclude you from this House and to the remainder of the city.
Mr. Paisley claims he was punched and that he later received a personal apology from the head of security for failing to protect him. The poster stated simply, John Paul II Antichrist, a reference to the view supported by Archbishop Cranmer in Reformation times that by claiming to be God's earthly representative, popes have usurped the position of Christ.
He remained unrepentant despite being accused of being a bigot.
But let me say this, if the honour of Christ is at stake, I would put my whole political career on the line for the honour of Jesus Christ and His truth. I happen to be a Protestant by conviction, and I'm not going to sell my Protestant heritage.
Hello and welcome everybody to the 16th reading of the wonderful book of the End Time Delusion by Steve Wohlberg. This book, this cover here. I announced that I wanted to read this book in German some time ago on one of my German videos, and today I received a comment from one who said, oh, I just ordered the book and then I read a little bit into it and then I looked the author up and then I saw that the author is a Seventh-day Adventist, and now I pity myself that I gave money to this book. I don't want to read any Seventh-day Adventist eschatology. I answer that man, well, there is no Seventh-day Adventist eschatology in that book. You know, you can sometimes read books from Seventh-day Adventists, or you can read books from Knights of Malta, or other people, or even Jesuits, and they contain a lot of truth. The only thing you need is discernment. And discernment you get by studying the Bible. So I didn't want to go into the discussion with that guy because he closed himself off to any reason anyway. But I just want to tell and repeat for anybody who's watching this video, neither Tom nor me are in any way, shape or form related to the Seventh-day Adventist or any other organized religion church in this world. We have nothing to do with those. But sometimes even people out of those congregations write interesting books. Let me give you another example. You have Bill Hughes, who is a Seventh-day Adventist pastor for years and who wrote some two interesting books, The Enemy Unmasked and The Secret Terrorists. You have men like Malachi Martin, who was lifelong a Jesuit himself and wrote a very interesting book, The Keys of This Blood. Or Peter de Rosa, who also is not a Bible-believing Christian and who wrote The Vicars of Christ. And you have, of course, for example, Avro Manhattan, who was a Knight of Malta and wrote many, 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 many books on the political and religious intrigue of the Roman Catholic Church of the last few centuries, especially of the 20th century. And I just received today a book that is called Vietnam, Why Did We Go? And started reading it. And I'm going to read that in the video reading also. It's not because he was a Knight of Malta that the book is completely full of lies. It is that because he was a Knight of Malta, what you read in those books, you have to measure against the Bible. And that's the same with Steve Wohlberg. And I read this book, End Time Delusions, from Steve Wohlberg, from the first to the last page. And the only Seventh-day Adventist teaching I found in there was the 1260 years prophecy being fulfilled between 538 and 1798, what they commonly teach. There is no other teaching of Seventh-day Adventists or any other teaching that is straying away from the Bible to be found in that book. But therefore you have to read it. And that man who wrote me that he now pities that he gave money for the book, I thought, well, yeah, okay, then you maybe would have looked it up online and just got the PDF for free, then it wouldn't have cost you any money anyway, is that he will stay in his deception and will not understand that the Antichrist is not future, and that futurism is the delusion that holds a grip on the whole of mankind. Because there is no other book to my knowledge where that is better stated than this book, End Time Delusions. And he may be a Seventh-day Adventist, but he was born a Jew. So now am I not supposed to read a book from a Jew? You see where I'm going with this? First look into the works and then judge. Jesus Christ said, by their fruits you will know them. You know what that means? You will not know them by with what people they surround themselves, what churches they go to, who their friends are, where they live, what they eat, what they drink, what they do. What they do, that is where you can measure them on, because what they do bears fruit. And if the fruit is good, then you should take that fruit and spread it around. If that fruit is bad, you should expose it. And that is exactly what Tom Fress and me are doing with this reading. And by the way, Tom Fress is still here with me today, and I want to very warmly welcome you to the broadcast, Tom. And I think that you have something to say on what I just opened the broadcast with, right?
Oh, yes, indeed. And I'm very pleased and blessed to be here. And I would indeed like to comment about the subject that you're currently speaking about. I myself have read this book personally, and I'm also familiar with Seventh-day Adventist doctrine and teaching, and Seventh-day Adventist eschatology. And I can tell you from my experience, Steve Wohlberg, though he may be Seventh-day Adventist, makes no Seventh-day Adventist apologies within his book. It's not a Seventh-day Adventist book. It's a book about speaking about Bible prophecy, and particularly the historicist view of Bible prophecy, as opposed or over against the futurist eschatology, which is taught in all the churches today, which was never heard in the Protestant churches until about 1805. This eschatology, called futurism, presumes that the 70th week of Daniel was not fulfilled by Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, but that the 70th and final week of Daniel's prophecy is detached from the 69th week of Daniel's prophecy and then cast all the way to the end of time, just before Christ returns, as if somehow just before the end of the race, God clicked the stopwatch, and the 69th week ended, and now the clock has frozen, and God won't start the clock again until just 3.5 or 7 years before Christ returns, and there will be a 7-year period of time where this 70th and final week of Daniel's prophecy will be fulfilled. It's illogical and it's ridiculous more than that, okay? It's a lie. It's a flat-out lie, and one of the greatest lies told ever since the Garden of Eden. Okay, there's no confusion in our Lord. The 70th week of Daniel began immediately after the conclusion of the 69th week. Not a nanosecond passed between the 69th and 70th week of Daniel. And the 70th week of Daniel marks the beginning of Christ's physical ministry on this earth. It was fulfilled perfectly and completely 2,000 years ago. Okay? That is the historicist view, that Daniel's prophecy in its entirety was concluded, sealed up. The vision and the prophecy was sealed up. In other words, it was finished. It was completed 2,000 years ago. And the 70th week of Daniel is literally the 7-year ministry of Christ. The first 3.5 years in the flesh, the second 3.5 years in the spirit. And the prophecy was for the Jews and Jerusalem. That was the going forth of the going forth of the gospel to the Jews. And the gospel was not to be preached unto the Gentiles until the end of that 70th and final week of Daniel's prophecy. And that ended with the stoning of Stephen, the final rejection of the Jews of Jesus Christ for their Messiah, and then the gospel has been delivered to the Gentiles, and it's been the Gentile objective ever since then to tell the truth. And the truth is, Jesus is Messiah the Prince. Jesus is the perfect and complete fulfillment of the 70th and final week of Daniel's prophecy. It ended 2,000 years ago. There is no future fulfillment of that prophecy or any portion of it. That is called futurism. It's a lie, the greatest deception since the Garden of Eden, and it has deluded all of Christianity today. Protestant and evangelical alike all believe in a future fulfillment of Daniel's 70th and final week, and it's not to be fulfilled by Messiah the Prince, as Daniel prophesied, but by the Antichrist. And it's the most ridiculous load of hooey you can even imagine, and that's why we're here exposing it. But this book, this End Time Delusions by the Seventh-day Adventist Steve Wohlberg, is not a Seventh-day Adventist book. It is an historicist book. It is of the school of eschatology, which says the 70th and final week of Daniel's prophecy was fulfilled immediately after the end of the 69th week. And there's no future fulfillment of any aspect of Daniel's prophecy. It was all wrapped up by Messiah the Prince 2,000 years ago. That's not a Seventh-day Adventist eschatology. That is a biblical eschatology. That is a Christian eschatology. That was the only eschatology that was believed in the Protestant and evangelical churches, the true believers of Jesus Christ, ever in the history of Christianity. Okay? Futurism, that which is believed by all Christians today, was only started in the Protestant churches in the the early 1800s. It is the newest kid on the block when it comes to eschatology. It is not to be believed. It is ridiculous. It counters the scripture, it counters history, and it ought to be forgotten and condemned as heresy. And we need to return to the historicist eschatology, the biblical eschatology, the historic eschatology held by Bible-believing Christians all the way back to the 1st century, and stop this ridiculous futurist interpretation of Daniel's prophecy and see it for its historical fulfillment. And this brings us to one thing that we But we must understand, if, as I insist, as Yerk insists, and as Steve Wohlberg insists, and I have numerous people who have uncovered the fallacy of futurism, as they all insist that we need to return to the original eschatology of Daniel's prophecy and know that there is no future fulfillment of it. And if there is no future fulfillment of it, which is supposed to be fulfilled by an antichrist, then we need to look back in history for the rise of the antichrist instead of the future. Okay? That's the point that most people miss. This is all about who the antichrist is. Since he cannot be revealed in the world in a future fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week, then he must be a figment of the future, or rather of history. I don't mean to confuse the listeners. He must be a figment of history. Okay? He must be a creature of history. When did the Antichrist, when was he revealed? It was not long after the first century. Paul warned that that power which was restraining the rise of Antichrist would continue to restrain his rise until he was taken out of the way. And when the Caesars of the Roman Empire were taken out of the way, then the man of sin was revealed. It was the papacy. Historicist eschatology sees the papacy, the office of the papacy, which was created 1600 years ago, was the very seat of Antichrist. And every pope in succession from the first to the last is the Antichrist of his day. The papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist. That is the historicist view. That is the Protestant and evangelical view prior to 1805 or thereabouts. The delusion is very young. It's ever since 1805 that it began to be taught in the Protestant evangelical churches of a future 70th week of Daniel, not to be fulfilled by Messiah the Prince, but by Antichrist. Okay? I hope I've explained it in a way that everyone can understand. So Stephen Wohlberg may be Seventh-day Adventist, but he's historicist in his eschatology. He maintains the same eschatology as every Christian, every Bible-believing Christian throughout the history of Christianity. It's the only correct view of Bible prophecy, the historicist view of Bible prophecy. It wouldn't make a difference to me if he were Baptist, Jehovah's Witness, or what he is. He's preaching the historicist view of Bible prophecy. He is to be trusted in his interpretation because it's no different than was held by the Protestant reformers, the evangelicals, and Baptists, and all the Christians, Bible-believing Christians, all the way back to the first century. Back to you, Yerk.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And I think it is also important that we make the point that that is the reason why we are not only reading this book, but we are discussing this book. We are doing more than just taking the book and reading page by page so that anybody who is just not able to read for themselves can listen. We are taking the book completely apart, in the sense that we go into much more detail than probably Steve Wohlberg ever had the chance to write it down. And we are using biblical discernment. Now, Tom always spoke of historicism, and you have to understand there are three biblical eschatology ways that you can use the Bible to explain the Bible. There is the historicist view, there's the preterist view, and there is the futurist view of history. And the preterist and the futurist view are both views that were invented by the Roman Catholic Church to take the heat off the papacy being the Antichrist, as was revealed in the 16th century to all the reformers, and as was revealed all the centuries before to everyone who had access to the Bible and read it. even Catholics themselves. So you can speak of historicism, you can speak of preterism, and you can speak of futurism. I prefer, instead of historicism, actually speak of the biblical view. It is the biblical view, it is the Bible interprets itself view that is the only one that can give you the righteous understanding or the correct understanding not only of the fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, but of the fulfillment of every prophecy in the Bible. It's only the view that comes out of the Bible, it is only in the words of God who explains it for himself to us, that is the true view. And all the views by men you have to put apart. But the problem is that there are many, many people in this earth who just don't want to study the Bible, and by that they don't understand what is written in there, and they give criticism of things they have no understanding of. Instead of that, they turn on a Sunday to any given church they enter. They check their brain and the Bible, if they have a Bible anyway, at the door, sit down in the pews, and listen to a teacher who teaches from the pulpit whatever he wants to teach them. They have no discernment, and those people are easy to get with quote-unquote arguments like, oh, but that's a Seventh-day Adventist, don't listen to him. I know that Seventh-day Adventists have an eschatology that is unbiblical, and there are many, many points I couldn't name right now, but this is not a video against Seventh-day Adventists, it is a video for the truth. And Steve Wohlberg, as Tom said, could be a member of any congregation whatsoever, as long as in his book there is biblical truth. We are going to read it and discuss it and explain it. Tom and I are well enough studied in the subject that we can tell whether an author is telling the truth or is not telling the truth. For me, you maybe don't know me that long, but for Tom, you can go to his record for the last 10 to 15 years on amateur radio, on ham radio, on First Amendment radio, and on YouTube, and see in his archives all the books that he read and discussed. And among all those books, there was another book, I just wanted to mention that, that was also written by a Knight of Malta, because I just mentioned Vietnam, Why Did We Go? Avro Manhattan as being a Knight of Malta. Tom also read this wonderful book, The Global Vatican, that was written by a Knight of Malta named Francis Rooney, who was the ambassador to the Holy See between 2005 and 2008. And he wrote a book where he explained exactly what is going on in the Vatican and what is going on in the world according to the teaching of the Vatican. I have the book here as a PDF, and I want to open it up because I want to read to you a few sentences, just one sentence, and I guess I have Tom's permission to do that. And that is on page Roman 16 of the prologue of the book, and these are the words of the author himself, who is a Knight of Malta, and by that is a papist. Yeah? He is an oath-spitting papist, but he writes, why is the power and influence of the Holy See underestimated? Part of the answer lies in the fact that it is an extraordinarily complex and unique institution and is therefore easier to dismiss than to understand. And the problem that you have with most people today is that they agree with what he says here. They think it is extraordinarily complex, and they just don't dare starting studying it. And when you do not study the Roman Catholic Church, you do not study the adversary of Jesus Christ, because the head of the Roman Catholic Church is the vicar of Satan on this earth, as we call him, the Antichrist. And if you do not do the effort to study this extraordinary complex system of Roman Catholic Church on the religious hand and Vatican on the political hand, then you will never ever understand what is going on, and you will always be deceived. And when you are being deceived, Well, this is the reason why Steve Wohlberg wrote the book End Time Delusions, because it is deluding the people who are living in the end times. Now, according to Jesus Christ, these are the end times. I think he said that in the Gospel of John. These are the last days. So Steve Wohlberg speaks about the deception of the last days, and these last days have been going on for 2,000 years, the quote-unquote church age. The Church of Jesus Christ is being tried and tried and tried and being lied to all through history. And that is why history, we pick up the historicist view, the biblical view of Bible exegesis, and will explain to you the Bible in a way as God wrote it. A 10-year-old, even a 9-year-old probably, can understand what we are teaching, because it is easy, because we teach from the Bible. We teach in God's words and not in complicated philosophy, sophistry, and casuistry as it is commonly used by the adversary. And I guess that Tom has another comment on what I just said here.
Well, all of your comments are well taken, and it's important for us to realize that the Christians today do not recognize who the Antichrist is for two reasons. Number one, they believe the Antichrist won't be discovered until the very end of time. That's error number one. Error number two is failure to study this complex system of religion called Roman Catholicism, to study its history, to study its false doctrines, to study its false miracles, to study its false prophets, to study its inquisitors, to discover unquestionably that it is the Antichrist described in the Bible. The papacy fulfills every Bible prophecy regarding the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist. And number three, your pastors don't tell you who the Antichrist is. But 500 years ago, all pastors of Protestant and evangelical churches screamed it from the rooftops. The papacy is the Antichrist. Do not look in the future for an Antichrist. He's been with us all since the 6th century AD. Okay? The Roman Empire never died. It simply morphed into the papal Roman Empire. When the Caesars were taken out of the way, the popes filled the power vacuum. When the Caesars vacated the throne in Rome, the popes took their seat. The popes have ruled over the kings of the earth, have persecuted God's people for 1,500 years. And this is not taught in the churches. That's why I say get out of the churches. Either get you a true Protestant pastor or get out of the churches and start your own house church and tell the truth about the Antichrist. But believe me, the Antichrist of Rome, the papacy, is no small study. It's 1,600 years of history that we've never been taught, not in the schools, not in the churches, not anywhere. You have to do your own digging or listen to the writings of the Protestant reformers and the Christians all throughout history. Look at the persecutions of the papacy. Look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church. And read the books that Yerk and I recommend that you read. We've done this research. We've done it for years, decades in my case. And isn't it funny? I agree with the Protestant reformers. I agree with the Bible-believing Christians of all time. And they wrote about this man of sin. They wrote voluminously about this man of sin. Their books are still extant. All you have to do is Google them. Many times they're in the public domain, and they're on the internet for you to read free of charge. Your mind can be restored to the truth, but you first have to give up futurism. Otherwise, there's no motivation to study the papacy. There's no motivation to study the Roman Catholic Church because you believe, if you're a futurist, Antichrist is not in the world today, was never in the world prior to today, and can only be found in the world in some future time. You have to get rid of that mindset. You have to get rid of that futurist indoctrination before you can ever be motivated to discover the historical Antichrist of Rome. And don't expect any help from your Protestant and evangelical churches. They're ecumenical. They want to unite you back to the Roman Catholic Church. They want you to join a global, quote unquote, Christian religion that views Mohammedanism and all the other religions of the world equal with Christianity. That's where the churches are going. They are no friendly place for Bible-believing, God-fearing people. And that's why I just tell people, get out. Just get out. You can read the scriptures for yourself and understand. But if you remain in those churches, you're going to remain futurist in your understanding, and you're never going to comprehend the historical Antichrist. You'll never know who really rules over the kings of the earth. You'll continue to be confused about politics because you cannot accept the fact that the papacy rules over the governments of the world. You can't understand why the United Nations acts the way it does because you do not comprehend that the papacy controls the United Nations. And when you understand who the man of sin is, who the Antichrist is, and how he's reigned over the kings of the earth all throughout history, then you can perfectly understand, as is described by Rooney in his book, The Global Vatican, that the papacy today rules over the kings and the governments of the world just like he did during the Dark Ages. And then all of a sudden, history and politics makes perfect sense. Current events make perfect sense. And they all gel. It all makes perfect sense. The corruption of this world comes from the papacy. The corruption of the papacy is not just pedophilia. It is torture. It is religious persecution. It is every vile thing in this world. And we've read the books, many of them written by Roman Catholics. So we cannot be mistaken about our assessment. We are in agreement with the Protestant reformers, agreement with truthful Roman Catholics about their own church. It can't be wrong. It just simply cannot be wrong. And what we've learned makes so far much more sense than anything we've been taught in the churches. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous that people believe the futurists lie. It is so childish. It is so lacking in support in history that it's just absurd is what it is. And so I'll turn it back to Yerk. I hope I've made the point.
Yeah, I hope we made the point also. I'm just looking for a little part in this book, The Global Vatican, on President Bush about the United Nations. I thought that was on page 216 or something, but I'm looking here. I couldn't find it. It is very.
You're talking about observer status?
Yeah, I'm talking about the part of the observer status that you were reading in the time of this book. And I thought it was here at page 216 something, but I just don't find it here for the moment. But that's probably because the book in PDF form has other pages, page counting than the real book has.
Yeah.
I can't find it right now, so maybe we can look that up another time, and not now spending too much time on the Global Vatican, which you have already read in 99 parts on First Amendment Radio, and I cannot but applaud you for that wonderful work that you did. And maybe before we go into today's reading of End Time Delusion, Tom, we can for once and for all make the point to the people that it is not because someone is a Knight of Malta that he doesn't have anything interesting to say. Because how you destroyed, and I really like to call it destroy, the work of Francis Rooney in his book, The Global Vatican, is just unreached. How do you say that? Nobody else has ever done a work like that to my knowledge, in the whole world.
For fear of sounding too self-complimentary, it's beyond
Unrivaled.
reproach.
Beyond approach. Yeah, unrivaled. Beyond approach. Unprecedented. Those were the words I'm looking. Yeah, I'm not the native English speaker. Sometimes I'm just looking for the words. That's exactly what I wanted to say. You just wipe the floor with this book, The Global Vatican, where Ambassador of the Holy See, Francis Rooney, praises the Roman Catholic Church. You throw it back into the pit where it belongs to. Where it belongs to according to the scripture, and where it belongs to the understanding of every Bible-believing Christian. You just wipe the floor with everything that Francis Rooney says here. He says one thing and you give the biblical explanation of it, and that is 180 degrees around than he says. And this is just so wonderful. I really applaud you for that book. I think it is the masterpiece of the work that you have done on First Amendment Radio in my eyes and my understanding. And I listened to that reading, all 99 parts, at least 2 complete times. So that's a lot of hours I spent there. And I can tell you, this book is a very dangerous book if you do not have the explanation that Tom gives along with it. If you just read it for yourself, it's a very, very dangerous book. But the point that I want to make is that when you read this book with biblical discernment, as Tom has, like nobody else I've ever known, then you can expose the lie and the delusion that this book will give you otherwise at first glance or at reading when you're not using biblical discernment. And that is the same with books like End Time Delusions. You have to have biblical discernment. And that is why I read the book completely, Tom read the book completely, and we didn't find any eschatology in it that does not derive out of the Bible. And therefore, it doesn't matter whether Steve Wahlberg is a Seventh-day Adventist, or a Jehovah's Witness, or a Baptist, or whatever. It doesn't matter, because he writes the truth. We are not here to venerate Steve Wahlberg. We are here to venerate the truth that is written in the Bible, and to bring to the people the biblical truth about the 70th week of Daniel, about the complete Daniel chapter 9 prophecy. That is important. Steve Wahlberg is just a tool in the hands of God. Tom is just a tool in the hands of God. And I am just a tool in the hands of God. At least that is what I pray for, because I don't want to be anything else. Otherwise, I don't have any reason to take a breath in the morning. And I think that is the same for Tom. We are using our biblical discernment, and with that we can read books even from people not coming out of the Protestant realm or out of the biblical realm, and then we expose what is a lie and we emphasize what is true. And that was our motivation to go to this book in the very first place. Let me tell you, Tom already read a big part of this book in First Amendment Radio years ago. It was not that easy to convince him to do it all over again with me, just because I discovered this book in his reading of Exploding the Israel Deception in 2010. And all of a sudden a world for me went open. I said, Tom, how come this author writes everything that you have always been taught in all these years on First Amendment Radio and probably on all the other platforms where you were on? This book contains everything Tom has always taught, and that means this book contains everything the Bible has always taught. And the Bible is always our pillar, which is for us the highest authority of our moral and of our biblical or religious understanding, if you will. Tom, can I interest you in another little comment before we go into the reading, or do you say no, let's skip it and go to the reading? What's your opinion?
Well, we need to skip it and go to the reading, but I just can't help but applaud Stephen Wahlberg for his efforts with this book. He's done a fantastic job with it. I highly recommend this book to anybody and everybody that wants to read it. The truth, futurism, is a difficult foe to destroy because it's been repeated so many times in the hearing of the people. But just let me tell the listeners, trust me when I tell you, historicism makes so much more sense than futurism. You'll be ashamed that you ever believed the futurist lie. I know that's the case with me, and anybody else who has abandoned futurism and has embraced the historicist interpretation of Bible prophecy. Back to you, Jörg.
Yeah, because all of a sudden everything makes sense.
That's exactly right.
On page 47, the author tells, and I'm going into a little repetition with the first two quotes that come from the 1846 Presbyterian publication the author wrote about a little bit earlier. We're reading these quotes and then 2 or 3 little more paragraphs, and that is the end of this chapter, which is dropping the bomb. The author says, the 70 weeks, or the author of this Presbyterian publication says, the 70 weeks of Daniel, therefore, have certainly ended many centuries ago. We are not to look to the future for the fulfillment of these predictions. We must look to the past. And if to the past, where is there one who can have any adequate claims to being the subject of these prophecies but Jesus? He, and he only, can claim them, and to him they most certainly refer. Another quote from the same book reads, one would think the people, speaking of the Jews, among whom these events occurred, could not possibly have misapplied the prophecy. Hey, but they did. In fact, one major reason why the Jewish nation as a whole failed to receive its Messiah was because its scholars misinterpreted Daniel 9:27. And that, my dear listener, is the same reason why the scholars of the churches today misinterpret Daniel 9:27 today, because they are fooling you as the Jews have been fooled 2,000 years ago. The Bible even records the fact they did not know the time of their visitation. They failed to see Jesus Christ as the predicted one who would die in the midst of the 70th week. Amazingly, the exact same thing is happening today. Sincere Christian scholars are now misapplying the very same prophecy.
Can I make a comment, Jörg?
Oh, please, Tom, I'm waiting.
I want the listeners not to miss the point the author has just made. The Jews knew not the time of their visitation. They did not know the precise time of Christ's appearing in Jerusalem, because their pastors, their rabbis, had deceived them about Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. They had deceived them about Daniel's prophecy. And likewise, today, Christians are just as deceived as were the Jews 2,000 years ago, for the very same reason. Our pastors have deceived us. It's history happening all over again. What we are doing is telling you the proper interpretation and historical fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9, verse 24 through 27, and that it was completely fulfilled by Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. There's not one whit of that prophecy yet to be fulfilled. The vision has been sealed up. It is finished. No one has authority to open that scroll and refulfill any portion of Daniel's 70th week. It's over. Okay? Any future refulfillment, in part or in whole, is designed to deceive you. And just as the Jews were deceived about their the coming of Messiah as prophesied by Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27, they are just as confused, just as deceived by their religious scholars of today about Daniel's prophecy, chapter 9, verse 24 through 27.
And how did they do that, Tom? Well, first
By
and
saying it's all to be fulfilled in the future when it was historically fulfilled in Jesus.
Well,
and if the Jews had been taught by their rabbis to mark the calendar 483 years from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to Messiah the Prince, they would have all been there waiting for Jesus to come.
we have also to understand, Tom, that in the Jewish Bible, the book of Daniel is not among the book of the prophets. So when the rabbis teach from their what they call Bible, Daniel is not among the prophets.
Daniel's omitted.
Daniel is omitted in the book of the prophets. I don't say that Daniel is omitted in the Bible, but it's not in the book of the prophets. It's probably in books of history, in the history books.
The problem today is they don't omit the book of Daniel. They don't omit Daniel's 70-week prophecy, but they lie about it. They tell a false interpretation about it, which has the same end result, deceiving God's people. And the result for us in our generation, not understanding the proper interpretation of Daniel's prophecy, is that we believe it's yet to be fulfilled in the future, but by an Antichrist, by the Antichrist. And all they have to do is put forward this phony Antichrist who will cause the sacrifices and oblations to cease, the very thing that Jesus did 2,000 years ago when he himself became the sacrifice. If he causes the future temple animal sacrifices to cease, then every Christian will believe that he is the Antichrist, and there'll be no way to convince them otherwise. So now the issue of Antichrist has been solved. Who is the Antichrist? Well, he's the future guy who causes the sacrifices and oblations to cease. They could conjure up Mickey Mouse to cause the sacrifices and oblations to cease, and every Christian would parrot the words, he's the Antichrist. Okay? All right, once Antichrist is known and out of the way and taken out of the picture by whatever means, then whoever wants to can go to the temple and proclaim himself to be Christ. And I know who that's going to be, just like you do, and just like Steve Wolbert knows. It's going to be the man who's claimed to be Christ all along, all throughout history. The papacy, the man of sin, the son of perdition, who blasphemously calls himself the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God. Listen, this isn't rocket science. This isn't so difficult that a child can't understand it. The secret to not being deceived is to comprehend that the 70th week of Daniel was fulfilled by Jesus, the Messiah, the Prince, 2,000 years ago. And that any talk of any future fulfillment, in part or in whole, of Daniel's 70th week is simply setting you up to, number one, witness a false Antichrist, and then to accept a false Messiah. And it's all intended to be performed in the world in some sort of believable fashion before the true Christ returns. Jesus Christ, the one who fulfilled the 70th week of Daniel 2,000 years ago. The world is prepared by our pastors, by our teachers, by our churches to identify a false Antichrist first, and then a false Messiah afterwards. And after everyone has been deceived, then Christ will return.
But it's a Christ of their choice.
When Christ returns, will he find faith on the earth? Or will the whole world be deceived and bowing down and worshiping a false Christ, the papacy? That's what's at stake. I hope the listeners understand what is really at stake when we're talking about futurism as opposed to historicism. That is what is at stake. Who will Christ find us worshiping on our knees when he returns? Will we patiently be waiting for him and ignoring all these false eschatological events in the world, like the restoration of the modern nation state of Israel in 1948, the restoration of the Jews to their land, the rebuilding of a third temple, which is not predicted in the Bible, the beginning again of animal sacrifices, where the Jews will eat and drink damnation to themselves?
As the Catholics do already.
As the Catholics do already.
I have another point to tell you, Tom, how subtle the deception of Daniel 9:27 in the futurist teaching is. The Bible speaks of many antichrists, and the Bible speaks of an anti-Christian system where the office of the papacy, whoever sits on that throne, is the antichrist. But when one dies, the next comes up. It's like you have the President of the United States. When one is done with the office, the next one comes up. It's like the King of England. When one dies, the next king or the queen comes up. The office always remains the same. That is how the Bible explains the Antichrist. It is a succession of people who are occupying the seat of Bishop of Rome. So many people. But when you read Daniel chapter 9 verse 27, and we speak about the he that causes the sacrifices and oblations to cease, the future Antichrist is just one single man. So where the Bible always teaches there are many Antichrists, and that starts already in John when he says there are already many Antichrists in the world today, yeah? There are many, not one. The futurist teaching speaks of one single Antichrist, where the Bible speaks of many, speaks of a succession, of a whole dynasty, you can call it, of Antichrists. That is how subtle the deception is. They turn the word of God 180 degrees around. When the Bible says it's many, the Antichrist says no, it's only one. But on Jesus Christ, who was only one and who is only one, the Roman Catholic Church makes many, because with the transubstantiation they produce as many Christs as they want.
That's right.
They have multiple Christs and one Antichrist. And the Bible says there's one Christ and multiple Antichrists. How about that for a deception, Tom?
Yeah. That's perfect deception. And it's amazing that anybody believes it. Number one, I mean, we all remember reading over and over and over where Jesus said, "Your house is left unto you desolate," meaning the glory of the Lord is no longer going to dwell in the temple. He said, God no longer dwells in temples made with hands. Why in the world is the whole Christian world waiting for a temple to be built in Jerusalem? To make animal sacrifices? When the Bible makes it perfectly clear that the sacrifices of Israel were a stench in God's nostrils. There's only one sacrifice that has the power to take away sin and to reconcile us to God and bring reconciliation for iniquity. That's the blood of the Lamb of God. And it was shed 2,000 years ago for us. There's no future fulfillment of any portion of Daniel's 70th week. And I hate to be repetitious, but you wouldn't believe how long it takes for this to finally sink into people who have had a whole life of being taught repetitively the futurist lie. And anyway, I'll turn it back to you so we can get to the book.
Okay, we still have a few moments to finish the reading of this chapter. The entire 7-year period of tribulation theory is an end-time delusion. It is a massive mega myth. It may even go down in history as the greatest evangelical misinterpretation of all time, or as the greatest deception since the Garden of Eden.
That's what I call it, the greatest deception since the Garden of Eden. If the Jewish rabbis deceived all of Israel by hiding from them Daniel's 70-week prophecy. It has been the priesters and the pastors of the churches of this country and the world who have deceived us about the same prophecy and has prepared the whole world to receive a false Christ. The consequences for not understanding Daniel's prophecy and its historical fulfillment in Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, perfectly and completely, is the equal downfall of Christianity as it was the Jews, because 70 AD, just 40 years after the crucifixion of Christ, all of Israel was destroyed. The temple was wiped off of that mountain, not one stone left upon another, and the Jews have been chased all over the world like vagabonds ever since. Guess what's going to happen to Bible-believing Christianity if they continue to believe in futurism? I just can't impress upon the listeners enough just how important it is for us not to get this wrong. And let me tell you, if you continue to listen to your Protestant and evangelical priesters in the Protestant Roman Catholic churches, you're going to be deceived just as the Jews were 2,000 years ago. And the consequences are going to be just as grave. Back to you, Jörg.
Thank you, Tom. The whole concept is like a gigantic bubble. Once Daniel chapter 9 verse 27 is correctly understood and the sharply pointed pin of truth is inserted, quote, pop goes the 7 years, unquote. It's a fact. There is no text in the Bible which teaches a 7-year tribulation. If you hunt for it, you'll end up like Ponce de Leon, searching for the mystical fountain of youth or fountain of life, but never ever finding it. The current debate and tremendous confusion over pre-trib, mid-trib or post-trib is really a smokescreen of the enemy to hide the real issue. Now, what's the real issue? We'll find out when we study what the book of Revelation truly teaches about Israel, what the book of Revelation truly teaches about Babylon the Great, and what the true understanding of Armageddon is. And then we will go into chapter 6, David von Biemer's secret, and that is, I am sorry to say, for another time, because we have reached the conclusion of today's broadcast of almost an hour. It was a short reading when we consider how many words we have read in the book, but I think that this up to now was the most important of all the 16 broadcasts of the reading of this book, and I thank Tom very, very much to be my guest and to repeat and to repeat and to repeat until quote unquote the cows come home the truth about Daniel's prophecy, chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And that's why I want to hand it over for Tom to give him the honors of the last words of today's recording. Please, Tom.
Just blessings in the name of the one who caused the sacrifices and oblations to cease 2,000 years ago. Jesus Christ, our Messiah and the Lamb of God, the one and only King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I'll see you next week.
Woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in the dark, and they say, who seeth us, and who knoweth us? Don't try